Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Josie, and I'm part of the public engagement team here at Alzheimer's Research UK. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in our Lab Notes online series for 2022. Today, we are hearing from Richard Merrick from the University of Cambridge and Professor Anne-Marie Minihane from the University of East Anglia. They will share their research into the impact of factors such as gender and diet on our brain health. But first, before we get started, I'll go over some housekeeping. So during the event today, you are welcome to switch on the automatic subtitles using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. They're not 100% accurate during the live event, but they will be edited so they are correct on the event recording. If you've missed previous events, you can watch them back in your own time as they are all available on the Lab Notes webpage or over on our YouTube channel. During this event, if you would like to ask a question, you need to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which will bring up the Q&A box where you can type your question. Please do submit questions throughout the event and we will answer as many as we can in the Q&A sessions after the talks. So now we're going to ask you a few poll questions before we get started, because while we can't see you due to the online format of today's event, we're really keen to know a little bit more about you. So these questions ask you to rate your current knowledge of dementia research. So number one, how would you rate your current knowledge of dementia research? Very high, high, average, low, very low. Which of these best describes your reasons for attending this event? So perhaps you have dementia, or you care for someone, or you have a loved one with dementia, or maybe you work in a field that's related to dementia. Or maybe you don't have a personal connection, but you're just really interested to find out more about the topic. And then also, is this your first Lab Notes event? So welcome if it is, and welcome back if you've been to one of our events before. So I'll just give a couple more seconds while everyone casts their votes there. And then once we've all voted, I'll share those results back with you. So there we go. So as you should be able to see, we've got a lot of you saying your dementia knowledge is average, and that's brilliant. And I hope that after today's event, you'll feel a bit more confident and feel like you know a bit more about dementia research. Good to see a mixture of reasons why people are here today. A lot of people here because a friend or family member has dementia. And oh, wow, loads of you, this is your first Lab Notes event. Well, welcome. Really, really pleased to have you. And welcome back to those of you who've been before. Hope you enjoy it as much as you have enjoyed our previous ones. So just before we pass over to our speakers, I've just got a quick few things to tell you about what we've been up to this week. And I want to tell you a little bit about our Think Brain Health campaign here at Alzheimer's Research UK. So let me just share some slides with you. There we go. So hopefully you can see my slides. So as I mentioned, this week at Alzheimer's Research UK, we have launched the latest instalment of our Think Brain Health campaign. We want to share with you the simple and everyday ways you can keep your brain healthy, as many people don't realise there are things you can do to look after your brain health and reduce your risk of dementia. So the causes of dementia are complex and include age and genetics, but research shows as many as 4 in 10 cases could be linked to things that we could potentially influence. However, only 1 in 3 people think there's anything they can do to reduce their risk of dementia. Our new campaign sets out to change this by sharing simple tips for looking after your brain health. So, as I mentioned, causes of dementia are complex, and while risk factors such as age and genetics are things we can't change, there are 3 simple rules that you can follow to help look after your brain. So our first rule is love your heart. Basically, this means what's good for your heart is good for your brain. Just like your heart, you can keep your brain healthy too. Regular exercise, a healthy diet, and not smoking are just some of the things you can do with it to help this. Our next rule is to stay sharp. Regularly challenging your brain and taking time for your mental well-being can help protect it as you age. This is all about doing activities that you enjoy, whether that's reading, playing board games, art, or learning a new language. Our next final rule is keep connected. Research suggests that social isolation and loneliness is linked to an increased risk of dementia. So keeping connected to the people around us is another good way to give back to our brains. You could have a virtual catch up with some old school friends or go for a walk and a chat with a neighbour. Whatever your situation, there are things you can do to look after your brain and protect everything that makes you, you. You can find advice and ideas on how to keep your brain healthy and reduce your risk of dementia at thinkbrainhealth.org.uk, where we have 40 simple tips for better brain health. And you can also take a quiz to find out the best brain health tips for you. So without further ado, let's move on to the focus of today's event. Our speakers will be talking about the links between factors such as gender and diet and the impact that these can have on dementia. We will be hearing from Richard first, followed by Anne-Marie. Once they've given their talks, I will be returning to the screen and we'll move to the Q&A session of today's event. You can submit questions at any point during the event and we will try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. Our speakers today are experts in their field of research, but they are not medical professionals and so will not be able to offer you any medical advice. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Richard Merrick. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Josie. And thank you all for joining us here today. I'm delighted to be speaking. Let me just share my slides and then we'll get started. So my name's Richard Merrick and I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. And I'm also training to be a consultant in public health. And I'm here to talk to you about gender and dementia. So just quickly, a brief recap as to what is dementia. Dementia describes a set of symptoms, including the decline in memory, reasoning and communication skills, and the impact they have on day-to-day life. As we know, dementia is a major public health priority. And we refer to it as an umbrella term that describes these set of symptoms which are actually caused by underlying diseases occurring in the brain. So here we see some examples in blue of the types of pathology that occur in the brain. And these pathologies cause damage to and loss of brain cells, the connections between them and the blood supply in the brain. And it's this damage in key brain areas that gives rise to the symptoms that we see as dementia. Now, the question as to whether your gender affects your dementia risk has been one with long-standing interest. It's been observed for a long time that more women than men are living with dementia. This is what we call prevalence, when we take a snapshot of the number of people living with a condition at a given point in time. Now, on the right here, we can see a figure from a recent study which produced global estimates of the number of people living with dementia now and looking ahead as to what may come in the years to come. And this clearly shows in red women, there being many more women with dementia than men in the blue line. Now, dementia risk increases with age. And we know that more women survive into the oldest age groups because of longer life expectancy in women. And for example, in the UK, the ratio of people with dementia is probably 6 to 4 women to men, which very much reflects the ratio in the oldest age groups. In terms of evidence with regards to the incidence of dementia, so this is the measure, which is a better measure of risk, and is a measure of the number of new cases that occur in a given time period. The evidence for this is much more uncertain and varies across time and place. And the UK is an interesting example. Now, before I talk about the best figures we have for the UK, I'm going to introduce the Cognitive Function and Aging Study called CFAS, which is the study that I work with, which is led by Professor Carol Brain here in Cambridge, and is a long-running study which started around 1990. involving multiple centres in England and Wales, and which randomly selected people above the age of 65 from the populations in these areas and followed them up over time to see who developed dementia. And this study visited people in their homes and in care homes, and with a focus on dementia, cognition, but also depression, disability, and health expectancy. And crucially, it used a very standardized method of diagnosing dementia. And one of the unique things about this study is that it was repeated with new samples from 3 of these centres 20 years later, which gives a really unique window into changes across time, especially with the use of this standardized diagnosis. And amazingly, the headline findings from this study is that over this 20-year period, we've seen, matched by age, a reduction in the proportion of people with dementia. So here we have a figure showing the changes in prevalence. So this is the snapshot measure. The blue bars show the results from the first study, CFAS-1, and the red bars show the results from CFAS-2. And here you can see a big change across this time period, especially in the older age groups. I also mentioned the measure of incidence, the measure of new cases developing in a given period of time. And again, here on the right, you can see the blue line is the first study and the purple line is the second study. And over this period, we see a 20% drop in incidence. And what's more intriguing is if you look at this split by men and women. So here we have on the left, the first study, and on the right, the second study showing the incidence results by age. The orange bars are for men and the purple bars are for women. And the fascinating finding is that this 20% drop is mainly driven by a drop in men, especially in the oldest age groups, but actually across all the ages. This was big news when this study was published. And here we can see a selection of headlines from the UK, highlighting both the drop in dementia incidence, but also picking out the fact that it was men who benefited most, with headlines such as "Healthy living leads to a huge drop in male dementia," and "Dementia rate falls as men behave themselves." So what might explain these trends that we've seen over time that have differed by gender? Let's talk a bit more about risk factors. Josie mentioned briefly about the Brain Health, Think Brain Health campaign. This figure on the left, which I will zoom in on a bit closer, comes from a real landmark study called the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, which looked at risk factors across the life course. This figure sort of stakes from early through midlife to late life. And this study took evidence from a huge number of studies and identified 12 potentially modifiable risk factors that account for around 40% of dementia cases. So let's take a look more closely to see how some of these may differ between men and women, either now or in the past. So starting off in midlife, the first risk factor is less education, not something you might immediately think relates to dementia risk. And this is something that I'll come back to in a moment. In midlife, we have a number of examples, including hearing loss, brain injury, high blood pressure, excessive alcohol use, and obesity. And in late life, we have smoking, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, air pollution, and diabetes. Now, a number of these risk factors relate to heart health. They're familiar risk factors that we know are important for heart health, as Josie mentioned. And thinking back to this question about the differences between men and women and how common these risk factors are, I've pulled out a few examples here in purple, examples which either historically or still currently show that are more common in women, and in orange, examples that still now in national health surveys are found to be more common in men, including a number of these risk factors associated with heart health. Now, those risk factors are ones which are well measured and show consistent evidence, but not necessarily the whole picture. And one example that's not there is diet, which Professor Minihane will be talking to you about next. Now, going back to that early life education and why that's important for dementia risk, this leads me on to the concept of cognitive reserve, which is something that we can build up through our life experience through factors such as education, a cognitively demanding occupation, and stimulation through social and leisure activities. And this can help our brains withstand the impact of pathologies in old age and either delay or prevent the onset of dementia. So across life, we have these risk factors which we can accrue, which are detrimental to our brain health, but we can also bolster our brain health and help buffer against the impact of diseases in the brain through building up this concept of cognitive reserve, which means that two people with the same level of a given pathology in their brain can have different levels of cognitive function because of different life experience. And going back to the question of the findings that we see in CFAS and trends across time, and the different frequency we've seen in risk factors between men and women, we can see that one of the things that women have gained from through the course of the 20th century through laws and policies that have promoted gender equality, they've gained in access to education and occupation. And the hypothesis is that the improvement seen in the dementia rates in men may be because they stood the most to gain from the prevention and treatment of heart disease or risk factors for heart disease in that time period, which is something that I'm looking to explore in more detail within the CFAS data. Now, we've touched upon these established risk factors and whether they're more common in men or women. And in many respects, these reflect social and cultural factors which have changed across time. And they show how social forces can affect our biology and shape our health. But there are also lines of evidence and ongoing research which link directly to biological factors which differ between men and women, or that have a greater effect in one. The main example here relates to hormone changes, either as a natural part of aging or due to medical interventions. In women, menopause is a universal life event in midlife, which is associated with decline in hormone levels and leads to short-term changes in cognition and mood. But the longer-term consequences and their relationship with cognition are more uncertain. There is evidence linking those who experience an early menopause or a menopause induced a surgical removal of the ovaries, that can be associated with late life dementia risk. But the evidence regarding the role of hormone therapy is still subject to much debate and is an area where there's been controversy in the past relating to other health outcomes. So it's an area of ongoing research, but where there's currently not indication of a role for dementia prevention. And this is something that Professor Minihane will talk about in more detail. For men, an example that relates to hormones is for men with prostate cancer who receive hormone treatment as one part of treatment for their cancer, which suppresses testosterone. And although the evidence is mixed as to whether this is associated with cognitive decline or dementia, some studies have found an association. And together this highlights the importance that where there are interventions that impact on hormone levels, that we carefully research and follow up to see the long-term impacts on cognition. The other example here I wanted to mention is a risk gene called apolipoprotein E, or ApoE. And one version of this gene is one of the most prominent genetic risks for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And there is evidence that the impact of that risk gene, which relates to the buildup of amyloid, may be greater in women than in men. So to quickly summarize, we've looked at the epidemiology of dementia. We've looked at how prevalence, which is mainly shaped by the age structure of those who survive to the oldest age groups, is consistently found to be higher in women. So more women than men are living with dementia. And we've looked at the figures from the UK, from the CFAS study, in particular the drop in incidence, so the number of new cases developing in a period of time, and how that is linked, how that's shown a drop driven by men. We've talked about risk factors across the life course and how they may be patterned differently between men and women, with some more common, either now or in the past. And we've talked about this balance between risk factors and cognitive reserve, and the fact that, again, changes over the 20th century may have benefited women in terms of cognitive reserve and men in terms of the prevention of heart disease. We've also talked briefly about some of the biological factors relating to hormone changes, either as part of natural aging or medical interventions, and the uncertainty about links to cognition and dementia and action that can be taken. So I hope this has been a useful introduction to the topic of gender and dementia, and I hope it shows that this is important to our understanding of dementia, the patterns that we see in the trends across time, and also that it can inform our approaches to prevention. So as a final thought, alongside the messages that we as individuals can change, which Josie highlighted through the Think Brain Health campaign, I think it's also important, especially as a public health professional, to remind us all that the actions we take as a society are also crucially important in reducing dementia risk, particularly as so much of our health is shaped by the conditions in which we grow, learn, live and work, many of which are outside our individual control. And if we're going to tackle health inequalities, we need to act at that population level. So I'd just like to finish by thanking Alzheimer's Research UK, my supervisor, Professor Cara Brain, and the CFAS team, collaborators, and the participants and their families. And thank you for joining us today. And I'll now hand over to Professor Minihane, who's our next speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Always nice to see the really interesting data which continues to come out of the CFAS study. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my screen with you. It's great to be here this afternoon. And what I'll be speaking about in the next 15 minutes or so is how nutrition and eating behavior can affect brain health, following on a little bit from what Richard started on as to what is known about the effects of menopause on cognitive function. And finally, really to speculate, because the research hasn't been done, but what dietary strategies could we suggest might promote health during the, or promote cognitive health during the menopausal transition. So just to start off by saying, and this is certainly a great public health and clinical success story, over the last century, life expectancy has increased 2 to 3 years every decade, which is tremendous. But that hasn't been matched by an equivalent increase in healthy life expectancy. So we're living longer, but our period of ill health is also longer. And for some folks, of course, that ill health takes the form of dementia or cognitive decline. And of course, that's not something we want as individuals or communities. We all want to live a long time, but none of us want to be old, of course. And along with adding life to years, along with adding years to life, we also need to be very much focused on how to add life to years. And with all the focus on dementia at the moment, we would be forgiven for thinking that we're all going to get it. But I will kind of draw our attention to the fact that in the population over 65 in the UK, 7% have dementia, but of course that means that 95% are dementia-free. So what I'm going to talk about today is strategies to stay in that bigger 93% bubble. I'm based in Norwich Institute of Healthy Aging, and our remit within the Institute is very much that remit of how to add life to years. And we focus on many of these behaviours around the outside here, in particular how nutrition affects aging, how smoking cessation, social interaction, sleep, physical activity, how all of those things promote health in general, but we're very, very interested in how they promote brain health in particular. Now, can lifestyle behaviours make a difference? So this is the first piece of evidence I'll present to you that it can, and it can make a big difference. And this is data produced from Chicago by a group led by Martha Claire Morris. And it took data from several thousand people, and it followed them up for 6 years. And it scored everybody's lifestyle on the basis of 5 criteria, which you can see here for yourself. Smoking, physical activity, alcohol consumption, the quality of one's diet, and whether one engaged in late life cognitive activities. And the maximum score one could get is 5. And the effect size of this on dementia risk was huge. So for people who scored 4 to 5 versus 0 to 1, you had a 60% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. And actually bringing it right back to more modest changes, even a 1 point score in the 5-point scale was associated with a 25% lower risk of dementia. I'm going to focus today specifically on nutrition, but I'd like to include in nutrition something that's often forgotten about when it comes to health, and in particular cognitive health. And actually one's hydration status is a huge determinant of cognition later in life. As we age, we're more likely to be dehydrated, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first is the functionality of the thirst centers in the brain tend to decline. Often old age is associated with impaired kidney function, so again, water retention problems, and also due to a general mobility problem. Often as people get older, they have mobility difficulties, therefore they don't want to be getting up and down and going to the toilet facilities on a regular basis. And all of these things kind of mean that older folk are more likely to be dehydrated, and dehydration actually is a huge source of poor cognition in older age, and one that can be very simply corrected. Now, getting on to diet itself, I'll start off talking about dietary patterns, and a big area of interest for us is the Mediterranean diet and its effect on cognitive health. Now, most of our shopping won't look that good when we take it out of the bags at the weekend. But this is what a very high quality Mediterranean diet looks like. A Mediterranean diet tends to be largely plant-based. So most meals will contain a selection of fruits, vegetables, grains. We'll have olive oil as the main culinary oil, and tend to include things like legumes, nuts, seeds, and herbs and spices are often used as a source of flavoring rather than salt. A Mediterranean diet will include fish, usually 2 or 3 times a week, and will have a low inclusion of meat. So red meat is consumed generally less than once per week in a traditional Mediterranean diet. and things like confectionery and sweets are also infrequently consumed. If alcohol is consumed, it tends to be of the wine variety, particularly red wine, and consumed in moderation and with a meal. Now, we use a scoring system to score people's diets as to whether or not it's adherent to a Mediterranean-style pattern. And it's a 14-point scale, and it includes the elements bullet pointed here. So olive oil is the main culinary fat, whether or not your daily diet has more or less than 4 tablespoons of olive oil, vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, red and processed meat in moderation, less than once per day. Sofrito sauce, that's an interesting one. In Mediterranean countries, the use of a sauce which is made out of olive oil, onions, garlic, and tomatoes is often a base for other dishes. Also fish, as I said, more than 3 times a week, etc. So if one were to have the perfect Mediterranean diet, it would score 14. Now, in Mediterranean countries, a traditional Mediterranean diet has been repeatedly shown to be associated with about a 20 to 40% reduced risk of cognitive decline in older age. But the question has always remained, would we have the same benefit in Northern Europe and in the Americas, for example, were we to adopt this kind of dietary pattern? And that is quite an unknown. But actually, we've embarked on a number of studies over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is work which has been funded by ARUK, excuse me. And the first was a reanalysis of the EPIC Norfolk study. Now, the EPIC Norfolk study is a group of people who were recruited in the early 90s, and they've been followed up ever since to look at the association between lifestyle and health and disease. We took 8,000 participants from the EPIC cohort, and we looked at cognitive function 16 years later. These people were recruited, as I said, in the early 90s. We scored the quality of people's diet using the MEDAS score. And we found that a higher MEDAS score versus a lower MEDAS score was associated with better global cognition, better verbal episodic memory. That's the ability to describe events that have happened in the past. And often people say when they're losing cognitive function that you're a bit lost for words. And the third advantage of a Mediterranean diet is that it was associated with better prospective memory. That's the ability to carry out tasks in the future that you had planned. For example, make that phone call, or hang the washing out, or put the bins out, etc. So, and actually, even a 1-point increase in the 14-point scale was the equivalent to about a half a year to 1 year of aging. So a rather large effect size. We also, with the help of ARUK funding, have carried out an intervention to see if we can support people in the UK to adapt a Mediterranean diet through providing people with foods, also inviting people to participate in group sessions, and supporting people using an online platform. We found with these approaches, we were able to increase people's Mediterranean diet score by an average of 3 over the course of 6 months. So if people started off at 6, they went up to 9, started off at 7, they went up to 10, etc., which was really encouraging indeed. But also, and we were really pleased to see over the course of 6 months, the adaptation of the diet was associated with better global cognition in our participants, better memory, and also better executive function. And executive function is described as our ability to plan, to focus attention, to remember instructions, and to multitask. So again, very encouraging findings. Now, there is a version of the Mediterranean diet which has emerged recently, again by Martha Claire Morris and her group in Chicago. And this is called the Mind Diet. And you will see from the foods listed there that there's a huge overlap between a traditional Mediterranean diet and the Mind Diet. But in addition, the Mind Diet promotes in particular green vegetables, and it promotes berries as a particularly potent food source when it comes to cognitive health. And also you see that a mind diet very much promotes fish. Now I'll mention berries just a little bit, and the evidence for berries and their effects on brain health is pretty consistent. And the reason for that is berries are very rich in a dietary component called anthocyanins, and the effects of anthocyanins on brain health have been consistently demonstrated. Actually, flavonoids are plant bioactives which are found in a whole host of foods, and particularly flavonols also, which are found in dark chocolate, tea, and red wine, have been shown to be beneficial for brain health. The other Mediterranean diet component, which I'd really like to focus on, is because it's potent and it's an area we've been working on for 20 years or so, is fish and omega-3 fatty acids. And the evidence again is emerging as being quite consistent and not just a fishy tale. So I'll just show you data from 2 studies which look at this. The first is the data from 5 studies combined, where they followed up 24,000 people over 3 to 9 years. And they found that folks who consume more than 4 portions of fish per week, compared to less than 1 portion, had an effect on cognitive function, which was the equivalent to 4 years of aging, which is a pretty large effect size. The second study was a study out of the US by the National Institute of Health, a much larger study, 420,000 people followed up for 16 years. And in this study, they found that people in the top 20% versus the bottom 20% of fish consumers had a 30 and 41% reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease death, whether you were a man or a woman. So again, a potent effect size. Why are fish so protective? Well, one of the reasons is fish, and particular oily fish, are a strong source of omega-3 fatty acids. And the brain is represented here as the cerebral cortex. This graph here just looks at different organs in the body and the amount of the omega-3 fatty acid DHA they contain. And as you can see, relative to something like the liver and the muscle and the heart, which contain less than 5% DHA, the brain contains almost 15% DHA. So the brain is very enriched in the omega-3 fatty acid DHA, and it's really essential for brain function, and particularly the synaptic regions, which were the area of neurons which speak to each other. Now, I often get asked, are fish oil capsules as good as eating oily fish? And the answer, I'm afraid, is no. And the reason for that is because fish oil capsules are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. But if you eat the food itself, it also provides a whole host of other beneficial nutrients which promote brain health. So if you can at all, it's better to eat the oily fish rather than fish oil capsules. Now, for the last 5 minutes or so, I'll move on to the area of menopause and its effect on brain health. The average age of menopause in the UK is 51 years. And menopause is the state of amenorrhea, or when you haven't had a menstruation for at least 12 months. That is preceded usually by about 4 to 10 years of what we call the perimenopause. And during this perimenopause and menopausal period, there's huge fluctuations and eventual declines in 2 hormones called progesterone and estrogen. And it's slowly beginning to emerge that for 2/3 of women, this period of perimenopause and early postmenopause can negatively affect cognitive function. But the good thing is most of that modest cognitive loss does come back as you transition through. Now, menopause is associated with the vasomotor effects, which many will be familiar with, things like hot flushes and night sweats, also things like vaginal dryness, reduced sex drive, and sleeping difficulties. But for today's talk, we're more interested in the cognitive effects. And for sure, there is evidence that for about 2/3 of women, they see modest effects on things like mood and anxiety and elements of cognition such as memory, concentration, and language difficulty as you transition through the menopause. But as I say, the good news is most of that modest decline in function does come back eventually. And it's very typically referred to as this brain fog, which many of us have experienced. And the reason for this is because if you take a snapshot of different areas of the brain and what they do, for example, the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is really important in the regulation of temperature, sleep, energy, balance, and food intake. And you can see the hypothalamus contains estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta, which means its functionality is determined by estrogen. Likewise, the hippocampus, it's important in processing and short-term memory, also has estrogen receptors and will suffer as a result of this decline in estrogen as women go through the menopause. And you can see for a whole host of brain regions, their functionality is in some shape or form modulated by estrogen and therefore will be affected by the menopausal transition. And we're now beginning to have a really nice understanding of kind of the physiological basis of menopause and how it affects brain health. And we know that the menopause can, at least temporarily, affect the structure and function of neurons. It can affect how we process beta amyloid, which is one of the main proteins involved in the pathology of dementia. It can affect cardiovascular health. It can affect the region, which is the interface between the blood and the brain, called the blood-brain barrier. It can affect our glucose utilization. And as we age, we get less efficient at utilizing glucose in the brain. And of course, glucose traditionally makes up about 95% of our energy source for the brain. And we have done a lot of work actually, which shows that as we age, and particularly as we go through the menopause, that this is associated with a decline in the level of the omega-3 fatty acid, DHA, in the brain. So if I was to speculate as to what should be done or what could promote brain health through the menopause, I would suggest anything that supports better glucose utilization, for example, a Mediterranean diet. I can talk a little bit in the questions if anybody's interested about ketones and ketogenic diets and what the evidence is for those. And certainly I would suggest that particularly as women transition through the menopause, to have an optimal intake of oily fish and DHA levels is probably a good idea. Also, certain foods contain what's called phytoestrogens, which are mild estrogens which are found in plant foods. Things like sesame seeds, flax seeds, soya products, green vegetables, dried fruits. So phytoestrogens are found in a whole range of plant foods. And even though the research hasn't been done yet, there's good reason to believe they may help the symptoms as women transition through the menopause. So I think that's me done for today. I'd just like to thank my collaborators over recent years. A big thank you to the funders and a particular thank you to the ARUK, who continue to fund a substantial amount of our work. And I'll hand back to Josie and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and I'll just invite Richard back to the screen as well. Thank you both so much for those talks. They were fascinating, really, really interesting. We've had some really good questions to get started with as well. So, Richard, I think we might come to you first. Okay. Someone just asks, could you just clarify again what cognitive reserve means? You mentioned it in your talk, but could we just have that explanation again? And then just to add on to that, is there sort of a biological way that we can measure cognitive reserve in a person, or is it just based on retrospective data, so like looking at our education records and monitoring our diets and that kind of thing?
It's a really interesting question. I think the idea originated as a way to explain the observation that some people with a certain degree of pathology in the brain were cognitively intact compared to someone else who wasn't. And by looking in the kinds of data which tracked things like years of education, they observed this pattern that those. So again, so those, for example, with the main measure used is something like years of education, which in no way captures the content of that education or the rest of someone's life experience. But even within that, we see this difference. So in a way, it's a slightly abstract idea because it's not necessarily something you can tangibly measure in someone. And in the studies that investigate its role, it's often measured through these rather broad brush proxies, such as years of education or the level of education you achieved, i.e. high school or degree. And again, kind of broad categories of occupation and occupational complexity. So an area that's not my expertise that might have some evidence is the sort of the brain imaging literature, where people, much more detailed measures can be taken of people's brain structure, connectivity. So I'm not familiar whether that literature has any sort of more measurable things, but in terms of the study that I work on, CFAS, it's these broad brush proxies which are used to then look at, because around 600 participants in CFAS donated their brains for examination after death. And so these measures can be used to look at who did or did not experience dementia in life relative to different degrees of pathology and these aspects of cognitive reserve.
Great, thank you, Richard. Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Richard, something I've always wondered is, can you catch up? So if you didn't have the availability of a lot of education early in life, can you, by engaging in education later in life, kind of up your cognitive reserve, as it were?
So I recently saw some evidence out of Tasmania, which did just that, and essentially sent people back to university in later life, and it did show benefits. And I think it's something where there's not really much of a literature about that sort of formal education in later life. So it was really interesting findings. But I think it really speaks to some of the Think Brain Health messages about, staying connected, staying sharp, about learning throughout life and doing stimulating and engaging activities with other people, and that, that push you to learn and engage.
Yeah, thank you. Coming along to lab notes. There's a great one for learning more.
Exactly.
We've had a similar question actually to one you asked then, Anne-Marie, but for you about diet. So you mentioned there was a positive effect about the Mediterranean diet after 6 months. This is a question from Amanda. She asks, is that permanent, or if the diet is worse later, is the benefit eroded? So does the benefit get bigger if a better diet is maintained?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it probably, the benefit won't keep going up and up, and you will lose that benefit, if you transition back to your earlier unhealthy diet. I guess the main point to say is it's never too late, certainly. I mean, the MEDEX study was done in people between the ages of 55 to 74. But in my opinion, it's never too late to start. I mean, ideally, when it comes to cognitive health, the better the lifestyle behaviors throughout life, the more effect it will have in later life. But it is certainly never too late to start. I mean, I guess when people get into the late dementia stage, when they've lost a significant number of neurons, maybe the effect size might be smaller, but still it's quite likely that behavior change will affect the functionality of existing neurons and help even in late stage dementia.
Cool, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we'd say that for any of those sort of messages about, healthy eating, exercise, all of those kind of things, staying sharp, like we've just said, it's never too late to start on something like that. Just having a look, we've got so many questions coming in, I can't almost keep track of them all. Let's pick another one. So Eva's been asking, well, actually, before we go on to that one, we've had a few questions, Anne-Marie, about different types of diets like vegans, and if people don't eat fish, are there any alternatives to those kind of diets that you could suggest? Or is the study at the moment just about Mediterranean diet?
Oh, I mean, a vegan diet is excellent. You know, there's no doubt a vegan diet is excellent for cardiovascular health. We don't know so much yet about a vegan diet and cognitive health and dementia risk, but all the early indications is it's going to have a really positive effect. I mean, if you're looking for your omega-3 from a vegan diet, things like rapeseed oil, walnut oil, flax oil are reasonable sources of the shorter chain omega-3. Now, the body can convert that to the longer form omega-3 you find in oily fish, but it's reasonably inefficient at doing so. But nevertheless, it's better than nothing. So if you are a vegan, you can get vegan capsules where you can get DHA from an algal source, or else I would say just if you want your omega-3s, to make sure you have a reasonable source of things like rapeseed oil or flaxseed oil or walnut oil in your diet.
Thank you. We've had a really interesting question. It's noted women have a greater risk of dementia. That you might not know the answer to this one, but is there evidence to show whether the risk is increased specifically in women that have had children in comparison to those who have not? Do we know if there's anything, or
I can say that there is research on this area, and there's certainly conflicting evidence. And it's a really interesting example of how it's not straightforward to unpick the social and the biological with some of these questions. And it can be really important to, for example, also look at the men. And so sometimes a simple comparison about, for example, the number of children. I've seen studies published around the same time that give the opposite result, that come from different parts of the world, but give completely opposite results as to whether more children leads to greater or lesser risk of dementia. And I've seen a really interesting study from the UK, which wasn't focused on dementia, but was focused on cognition, and looked at men and women, and again showed similar patterns across men and women, arguing that the number of children was often an indicator of socioeconomic status, for example. Not wishing to make sweeping stereotypes or anything, but just in terms of something that the thing you think you're measuring and what that might relate to might actually be a reflection of something else which shapes the pattern of the outcome that you see. So it's an area of ongoing research, and also, for example, sort of length of reproductive years as sort of a marker of kind of lifetime estrogen exposure, for example. So there's definitely not a concrete answer about the question of children.
Thank you, Richard. I think those population studies are so massive, aren't they? There's almost too much data to analyse, and that's why they can take a long time to come to some conclusions. Again, the questions are just rolling in. We'll take one from an anonymous attendee. So, in studies assessing people's diet and cognitive ability, what happens if the participant's diet changes over time? I think we've sort of covered this one slightly, that part of the question, but the next part is there a way in studies you can account for these changes or measure diet more objectively?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there's a huge factor that when you actually ask people to record their diet, and we all do it, we give the best version of our diet because we don't want to make it seem on paper that we're doing anything that might harm our own health. So actually, accurate dietary records are a difficult thing to get. I mean, the best you can do is to take a record of people's diets on more than once. But also there's an emerging field of biomarkers where you can actually measure a whole host of things in things like blood samples or urine samples, which kind of reflect people's dietary exposure. But as yet, they're probably semi-quantitative in that they can give you an idea whether somebody's a high consumer or a low consumer, but they don't contain that granularity. So you're absolutely right. Our ability to assess diet accurately is something which is an ongoing endeavour.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay, I think we'll just go for perhaps one more question, and then I'll ask you both just a round-off question as well. So a couple of people actually have been asking, is fasting beneficial? Anne-Marie.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think it's kind of known for cardiovascular health. So there's an idea, if you fast, you kind of reset your metabolic processes, which could be associated with physiological benefits. And I know for cardiovascular health, there is some evidence that might be the case. I think for cognitive health, we're nowhere near that yet. I mean, I have to say, when you look at nutrition and cognitive health, probably the research is about 20 years later than it is for cardiovascular health. So I think those kinds of studies haven't been done yet, but a really interesting question.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Perhaps you might have just answered the question I'm going to ask you next, and that's to round off. What's the area of dementia research that you're most excited about for the future, or the thing that you think is the most interesting that's upcoming?
I think for nutrition, it's kind of workout strategies. We know a lot about what we should be doing. The trick is, how do we support us all as individuals and communities to adapt those healthy eating behavior guidelines? And I think Richard alluded to it a little bit, that public health is more than us, providing people with guidelines, that we need to think hard how we organize our healthcare systems and our communities and our societies to allow us all to easier adapt these behaviors in a cost-effective way. So I think there's a lot of research that's kind of moving out of the research park and into the community around supported eating behavior. I think that's a really exciting development in the field of nutrition.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And Richard, the same question to you, just to round off, what area of dementia research are you most excited about for the future?
Well, I think it's really translating what we know about what is possible through prevention into action. And there's such huge kind of overlap with other prevention agendas for major diseases like heart disease and cancer, and really driving that prevention agenda and making sure, raising the awareness, but also getting that action at the kind of policy and government level that can really, we've seen what can happen in 20 years, and that is really exciting for future benefits.
Thank you both so much. That as we approach 3 p.m, I'd just like to round off there, and just really fascinating talks, and it's such a shame we didn't have enough time for a longer Q&A. I feel like we could have just had an hour of questions. So thank you both. I'll say goodbye to you now.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
And just before everyone leaves our call today, we've just got a couple of poll questions that we'd love you to answer, just to quickly hear how you found today's session. So those should be just on your screen now. So, was the content of the talks too technical, just about right, or did you find it too simple? Would you recommend our Lab Notes events to your family and friends? And our most important one, do you think you've learned something new about dementia research? So I'll just give a couple more seconds while you answer those questions. Okay, so there we go. Most of you found the talks to be about right. That's brilliant. And you would recommend Lab Notes, and you've learned something new about dementia research. Oh, perfect. That's just what we want to hear. So we'll be sending out a more detailed feedback survey to you soon, and the video recording for the event will likely come next week once we've just edited the subtitles. So please do complete that survey, as we really appreciate any feedback that you can give us about the event. All of our recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to find previous events on there as well. So we have some more slides to share with you just about our next event, which will be taking place in April. The date is just to be confirmed at the moment, so you can keep an eye on our website, and we'll be sending a bit more information in our email with the recording next week about that, and it will be about frontotemporal dementia. And I know today that there were also some questions that we weren't able to answer, just we had so many, and that's really brilliant. And also probably some questions where you might need some more personalised information or guidance on where to turn. So our Dementia Research info line is there to help with this. They can answer questions and signpost you to other sources of information and support. So please do get in touch with them if you need to. And the information about that is in the chat now. So just to round off, I want to say a huge thank you for joining us today. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and we really hope to see you again soon.